Bonjour, je m'appelle Sébastien Beaulieu, je suis ambassadeur du Canada au Sénégal et coprésident associé du Forum de Victoria. Ça me fait plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette conversation importante sur un sujet qui vous est cher et qui m'est cher aussi en tant que diplomate canadien. My name is Sébastien Beaulieu. I'm Canada's ambassador to Senegal and associate co-chair of the Victoria Forum, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on trust in multilateralism. Le Forum de Victoria, c'est un partenariat entre le Sénat du Canada et l'Université de Victoria. Et l'événement d'aujourd'hui vous est présenté en collaboration avec le Canadian International Council, le Conseil international du Canada, et le Center for Global Studies de l'Université de Victoria. I'll now turn it over to Oliver Schmidtke, Director for the Center for Global Studies at UVic, to frame the conversation. Merci beaucoup d'être là. Thanks everyone for being with us. Over to you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to all of you around the world to join us for this iteration of the Victoria Forum here at the University of Victoria. And what we're going to do today is to address one of the key pillars of the post-war global order, namely multilateralism and its underlying commitment to address security issues, political and social stability from a collaborative, joint approach in the international arena. And with respect to the key theme today, trust and multilateralism, we are facing a fundamental paradox. On the one hand, we are confronted with challenges at a global scale that require close international collaboration. Just think about the existential, environmental, security, or health issues that we are facing with growing urgency in the international community. I don't have to remind you of the COVID pandemic that has underlined the urgency of taking a joint multilateral approach to addressing such crises. But on the other hand, we also have a strong push towards retreating from the principles of multilateralism and joint efforts in the international arena. The promise that withdrawing from our borders and behind our borders is in our best national interest holds considerable political weight in today's world. The resurgence of populist and nationalist forces both drive this agenda, but they also benefit from a deep-seated consideration of whether this is indeed the best way forward. And even in places like the European Union, arguably the most advanced and ambitious multilateral agreement that even questioned the sovereignty of a nation state at a particular level, you have strong tendency to, again, retreat to the nation state as the safe place to address those kind of issues. I don't have to mention Brexit or think about the response, the failed response, as I would argue, to the global so-called refugee crisis. Now, when we consider mistrust and multilateralism, we should recognize the growing popular discontent that is driving this, discontent with globalization that has fed, in a way, the backlash against organizations such as the European Union, the WHO, the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN. And these organizations have lost widespread support partly because of the prevalent suspicion that these organizations are tilted and very much based and favor those that have power and that have money. And in this respect, I think we could speak about a legitimacy crisis of these multilateral organizations in today's world. And if we think about how this crisis can be addressed, I think addressing this popular discontent is critical in giving multilateral organization a new mandate for the 21st century. Now, to address this paradox, we are honored today to have the Honorable Senator Peter Beam to lead us through the discussion in a moment. Let me briefly introduce Senator Beam. In his distinguished career in public service, Senator Beam was at the very center of nurturing those multilateral projects and organizations that I just spoke about. Most recently, before his retirement in 2018, Senator Beam was Deputy Minister for the G7 summit and personal representative of the Prime Minister. And before his appointment, Senator Beam had been Deputy Minister of International Development and subsequently Senior Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. And from 2013 to 2017, he concurrently served as Sherpa for the G8 and subsequently the G7 summits, as well as a nuclear security summit. Furthermore, as a career Foreign Service officer, Senator Beam served as ambassador to Germany from 2008 to 2012, and previously as Assistant Deputy Minister for the Americas, North America, and Consular Affairs. Senator Beam is recipient of the Public Service of Canada Outstanding Achievement Award and Canadian Foreign Service Award for his contribution to advancing peace in Central America. In 2018, Senator Beam was appointed to the Senate of Canada, and in this role, he joins us today. And with this, I would like to welcome Senator Peter Beam and thank him very much for being available for today's session of the Victoria Forum. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you for that too generous introduction. I'm very excited to be here. I want to thank the Victoria Forum. I want to thank Dean Saul Klein and Ambassador Sébastien Beaulieu, my former colleague, for their leadership in this very vital forum. And I'm very pleased that the Senate of Canada is in fact a co-convener or a co-sponsor of this event. And I'd like to also thank the private sector who is supporting this as well. We have, I think, a fantastic panel today to look at trust in multilateralism, and I would like to welcome them. And I will do that, of course, individually as they get their turn to speak. But I'd also like to offer a welcome to all of you who have joined us today. I know there are many practitioners. There are those who work in multilateral institutions. There are those who work in foreign and trade and economic ministries, members of civil society and other organizations. Thank you for joining us. This is an important discussion. We are in the midst of a global crisis that has no precedent. There have been pandemics, plagues, influenza epidemics in the past, but none that have been as globalized as this, and none that have had such an impact on potentially on global governance, and indeed not just the health, but the economies of countries all over the world. So as we get through this, we have institutions, as Oliver has suggested, that might be a little bit creaky. They've been around in many cases for 75 years, and in fact, we are celebrating this year the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IFIs, have been around for a long time as well. To an extent, they've been able to adapt to changing circumstances. To an extent, they have also suffered from everything from political divisions, from nativism and isolationism, some of which we are seeing now, from cynical manipulation, and from, of course, a shortage of budgetary inputs and funds. And this is also an important element. So the trust, with trust, you also have to have a fair amount of knowledge. We can ask the question of whether global citizens and indeed people are aware of what these institutions do, how the institutions could better present themselves. And also that key question of the rules-based international order has been in the news a lot in my country, in Canada. What does this mean? And what essentially it means is that to have good global governance, all members, all countries have to give up just a little bit of their sovereignty to advance a common agenda for the common good across the planet. So I think we're going to have a very good discussion. And I'm going to jump in right away and introduce our first panelist, a very distinguished commentator and expert, Professor Joseph Stiglitz of Columbia University. You've all read his biography. Some of you, I'm sure, have read his books. He is a very active commentator on the current state of the globe. He has won the Nobel Prize in economics. He's been chair of the Council of Economic Advisors of the President of the United States. He's been the chief economist at the World Bank, and so on. I know he has views, and he will give them to you now. So, Joe, you have the screen, as they say.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be able to participate in this discussion. The pandemic has obviously thrown up a lot of discussion about multilateralism. What I wanted to do is begin a little bit talking about the state of multilateralism before the pandemic. The pandemic has hit at a moment in which multilateralism was being undermined on two different sides. On the one hand was the growth of protectionism in the United States, many different forces that can be used to explain it. Earlier, Oliver made some reference to the elitism, the failure of globalization to produce the gains for all that led many to believe that the whole global architecture was designed for the 1% and by the 1%. And that obviously undermined trust in multilateralism and globalization more generally. The facts are clear that large fractions of the population in advanced countries have not done very well over the last 40 years. But globalization is only one part of the problem. But the fact that the elites did promise that globalization would lead to everybody being benefited, and that those promises were not fulfilled, naturally led to skepticism of almost everything that they said, including the role of financial institutions and the role of the multilateral institutions. But there's another aspect undermining multilateralism at this particular moment that existed, was beginning to play out before the pandemic, but as under the cover of the pandemic has gone much further. I want to take you back to the fall of the Berlin Wall, to the end of communism, where Francis Fukuyama wrote this very powerful idea called the end of history. The belief was that we were all going to move towards liberal democracies and free market economies. And globalization was going to accelerate that process of convergence. And so what we needed were a set of rules, global rules, that facilitated all of us working together. Borders were not going to be important in this new, you might call it nirvana, that was promised. Well, things didn't turn out that way. And in particular, the hope that we would all be moving towards liberal democracies has not been fulfilled. A majority of people today live under governments that are far from democratic. And here in the United States, we have a president who has an affinity for authoritarian figures. And we've been appalled what has been happening in Portland, the use of federal police forces in seemingly unmarked uniforms, unmarked vehicles, taking people off the streets, So let me put it just very broadly. Authoritarianism is on the rise. And what does that mean? That means that this kind of picture that we can all work together through whatever institutional arrangements doesn't look quite so optimistic as it did in 1989, 1990. I'll come back to this later on in my remarks. Now, the pandemic itself has exposed both the need for multilateralism and at the same time, the limits of globalization as it has been previously managed, structured, in part by the multilateral institutions. The need has been absolutely evident. Global warming, global pandemic, global health are global problems. As many people have said, CO2 molecules, the virus, don't respect national boundaries. They don't carry passports, they don't carry visas, and whatever one country does, it has consequences for others. Global warming, if one country, the United States or China, pollutes, it affects the whole global environment. And the same thing is true about the control of the disease. If it's not controlled everywhere, we will all be affected. And the same thing is true of the global economy. If we don't get a robust recovery anywhere, everywhere, it will be difficult to have a strong post-pandemic recovery. Unfortunately, many of the global rules reflected a corporatist agenda. And there's a lot of discussion of the global rules concerning trade. That was brought home a little bit more than 20 years ago in the Seattle protests. And in a way, today, in the midst of the pandemic, what we are seeing is how the global IPR rules reflect a corporate agenda. In fighting the pandemic, nothing is more important than that all the knowledge be shared globally. And yet, our intellectual property regime is a very big business corporate property regime. And you can see the big pharmaceutical companies licking their lips about the profits that they are likely to make. The priority has not been to get the medicines to everybody at as low cost possible, as fast as possible. That has been the agenda of the global scientific community. Let me emphasize that. One of the things that's been very heartening to me is watching the global scientific community putting aside all their concerns about priority publication and saying, we have to share, we have to work together to do what we can to fight this disease, to learn about it, to develop tests, therapeutics, vaccines as fast as possible. That's the scientific community. But the drug industry and some of our national governments have been on a different page. And we've seen vaccine nationalism, for instance, growing. There are other, you might say, ugly sides that have been exposed by the pandemic. The global supply chains that have been created as a result of globalization have been shown not to be very resilient. A country like the United States could not even make the masks and protective gear that were needed, let alone more complicated products like ventilators and tests. And so we've seen how the interaction between globalization and short-termism, short-sighted markets have led each of our countries to be more exposed than we would have hoped. So this is some of the downside that we've seen. But on the positive side, multilateralism has saved us from what could have been a real disaster. I think both the WHO and the IMF have played a very important role. The WHO may not have been perfect, but what institutions are perfect? And the IMF and the WHO have been among the strong forces calling for a global response, both in terms of the health of individuals and the health of the economy. The initiative of Costa Rica at the WHO to make sure that all the intellectual knowledge, all we know is available to all with some sense of global prioritization has been really important. And it's been very disappointing to me that many of the American and other drug companies have not participated in that effort. In terms of ensuring that there is help for the poorest countries, the IMF has played a very important leadership role. In addition to that, this is a moment, the economic downturn associated with the pandemic, in which we are seeing once again, some of the weaknesses in our global financial architecture. Many countries are likely to have debt crises. And we know how devastating debt crises can be in normal times. But in the midst of a pandemic, a debt crisis is going to mean large numbers of unnecessary deaths. The first debt crises are already on, Lebanon, Ecuador, and Argentina. And what we've seen from the private sector has been, quite frankly, appalling. The IMF has calculated what Argentina, for instance, can pay. It has defined what is sustainable. That is to say, you can't squeeze water out of a rock, and there's only a limited amount that a country can pay. And the creditors have said, no, we want more than what is sustainable. We don't care, in effect, they have said, if people die as a result of our greed. They haven't put it that way, but that is the gist of what they've said. They have even put a power play to restructure the debt contracts to give more opportunities for the vulture funds. So it has been a big disappointment that even creditors who have made a pretense of being good corporate citizens have acted in a way that represents the worst of social irresponsibility. And it is only the international institutions, the IMF, that have spoken up and tried to lead towards a way of dealing with the debt crisis that is sustainable. So the point I want to make is this is a moment more than almost any other where multilateralism is needed. And our multilateral institutions have actually, I think, behaved in a very good way. They've risen to the occasion. So let me just, in the last couple of minutes, talk about my hopes for the future, and that is for a reconstruction of multilateralism, a regaining of trust in multilateralism, a recognition that the global problems that we share together, the problems of climate, health, will only be solved through cooperation And our multilateral institutions are the institutions that we have created to enable us to cooperate together throughout the world. But at the same time, we have to recognize that that Fukuyama's hope of this end of history, the convergence, is not where we are. There will persist deep differences in values, in concerns about democracy, in concerns about human rights, that we, some of us, believe very strongly on, are at the heart of what we care about. But we will have to learn how to cooperate with those whose values, whose political system and economic system differ from those in the United States and Canada. And that, I think, will be the challenge for the coming post-pandemic world. How do we create a multilateralism that works in a world in which we are not converging, but in which there will be many countries that do not share our values, our concerns about human rights and democracies? We need to continue to fight for those values, but we also need to fight to make sure that our climate change is averted, that we prevent the spread of disease around the world. So multilateralism, a reconstructed multilateralism, is going to be the foundation of those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Those are very trenchant comments, and I think really get us moving. I'll go directly to Ambassador Leslie Norton, who is Canada's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva. I have the pleasure of knowing Leslie quite well. We've worked together. She has a vast background on international humanitarian efforts, and no better time than the moment to contemplate that, and also has a very intimate knowledge of Africa, where some of the development challenges are, of course, the greatest. So without further ado, Ambassador Leslie, you have the screen.
So thanks very much, Peter, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation to be with you here today for this very important discussion with such distinguished panelists. And welcome everyone. Je suis ravie d'être parmi vous. Aujourd'hui, mes commentaires seront livrés en anglais seulement, mais bienvenue à toutes et à tous. I'd like to take a few, first of all, start off with a few general comments before I tackle the questions posed, if that's okay. And the first is that as it's still early days, the impact on multilateralism and on multilateral institutions is evolving as the pandemic continues also to evolve. As we know, the scope and scale of this pandemic continues to test every community, country, and international institution. And we'll be sorting through the significant global health and socioeconomic ramifications of this crisis for some time to come. While many countries are finding pathways to recovery, many have not yet seen the peak, and I'm thinking here of the most vulnerable countries. For instance, last week, Mark Lowcock, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, launched the largest UN humanitarian appeal ever, calling this the largest crisis the world has faced in the last 50 years. So learning lessons in the middle of a global crisis is necessary to adapt our response in real time, but drawing conclusions too early can be inherently risky, but doing so is also necessary if we want to shape what is to come. We all know that crises have proven to be moments of transformational change for institutions, so it begs the question whether the current combination of COVID-19 and all that it has exposed, as well as climate change, ongoing conflicts in many places, and record levels of human displacement. Apparently 1% of humanity is currently displaced. Whether this will provide such an impetus, but perhaps that's a topic for another day. The question posed is, how has trust in multilateral institutions eroded during the pandemic? And I'm going to focus on, has trust eroded as opposed to how trust has eroded with its embedded assumption. But before I do, I just want to make 3 points, and some of them might echo what Professor Stiglitz just said. First of all, COVID-19 has not happened in a vacuum. I think that all are mindful that this crisis is seen as exacerbating existing global trends, including geopolitical competition, state reliance on unilateralism and protectionism, increase inequality and challenges to democratic values, and the assertion of alternative models of governance and development. And that's to name just a few. Secondly, multilateralism is not generalizable. So the terms multilateralism and multilateral institutions are often used as shorthand for the UN, but NATO, the EU, the OAS, AU, IFIs, WTO, regional organizations, they all have significant impact on interests and outcomes. So these organizations have very distinct political ecosystems, and they feature vast differences in terms of quality, operating style, and operational versus normative functions. So we need to be really careful to avoid overly reductive observations in this discussion. And third, and many would argue and have argued that trust in multilateralism and in multilateral organizations was already well in retreat prior to COVID-19. They argue that the most obvious symptom of this trend is the inability of the international community to address armed conflict in any meaningful way within the Security Council. There are many other examples they could point to. They might point to certain state parties, to the 1951 Refugee Convention abandoning their legal responsibilities, or to the general decline of international respect for human rights, the lack of progress in the Conference on Disarmament, frustration with the WTO and NATO. But I have to say that for each one of these examples of retreat, there are also really good examples of where multilateralism and its organizations are currently or have effectively delivered on an agenda. They just might perhaps not have been as tweetable. So what's changed since COVID? What I want to do is just, as I move through addressing the questions, it just might be helpful to first look at some of the things that might have changed for us in the multilateral remit since COVID-19 arrived. So first of all, the methods of work have changed. We're living through it right now. We were forced online overnight. And although there's been resumption of some meetings in person, there are many that are hybrid right now, and many that are also online. Short-term priorities have changed and states are somewhat distracted, that's obvious. There's been new emphasis on health diplomacy, supply chain diplomacy, and economic security. And global health and pandemic preparedness will continue to be hot for a while. There's also been less bandwidth for other crises such as climate change. Secondary and tertiary effects of COVID are creating new priorities, and COVID is reducing the bandwidth that we have for ongoing task of actually defending the rules-based international order, the RBIO. There's a significant number of norms aligned with our values that require defending, and it's anticipated that the scope for progress will be minimal going forward. On the other hand, in some cases, little has changed. Key players in some of the organizations in the global security realm and the humanitarian development remits, and recently actually at the Human Rights Council, are doubling down on the institutions in which they see their interests served. In organizations that key players do not necessarily view as helpful, COVID has exacerbated existing divisions and trends. And an example here is the OSCE's deteriorating consensus on arms control. And in some cases, member states have actually invoked COVID as the key motivation for supporting or rejecting initiatives. So, and finally on this point, key fault lines on major issues such as climate change, nuclear issues, European security remain stable. So has trust eroded? Early evidence is suggesting that COVID-19 is accelerating and intensifying negative dynamics in some organizations. It is having minimal impact in others. And it's providing new impetus in some. The IFIs were mentioned, and WTO is also has new impetus. But it's also leading to new collaborations, and one of which I'll highlight shortly. Some actors and institutions have performed effectively thus far, while others are underperforming, either because they've not yet adapted to alternative platforms or prevented from doing so by the pursuit of the national self-interest of some states. Concurrently, though, it's also really important to note that many states continue to see multilateral institutions as partners of choice in responding to COVID. Despite the US withdrawal, WHO has raised close to $1 billion US for its COVID response. And states tend to provide funds when and where there is trust. And here I want to mention a new global collaboration born as a result of COVID-19. In April, a coalition of international organizations and countries, they came together to launch the Access to COVID-19 Tools, or ACT for short, accelerator to oversee the development, production, and equitable distribution of affordable COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. It's unprecedented in terms of how quickly it came together and in the ambition of its mission. Prime Minister Trudeau co-hosted with the EU and Japan a May 4th pledging conference on COVID vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, which raised $8 billion US. So the ACT Accelerator is really a major locus for COVID-19 diplomacy and multilateralism, and is a testament to the power of multilateral action. It's called actually vaccine multilateralism. It's really important to note that over the years, multilateralism has had frequent challenges, many of which have prompted questions over whether a particular institution will survive, and past experience suggests a significant degree of resilience to some quite fundamental changes. But it's really interesting because one of the dynamics that makes multilateral institutions resilient is the reality that multilateralism is not and has never been perfect. There have always been structural and geopolitical challenges to be navigated and or accepted, and which is really, you know, it's not a bad thing, because at the end of the day, what we're really seeking is to maximize what we're achieving using these imperfect instruments, and they're not always used alone. We combine them with the other tools in our toolkit. But we do work hard to make them as efficient and as effective as possible. And we really need to be flexible and innovative in our approach, working with the individual strengths of, or the strengths of the individual organizations. And perhaps most importantly, we need patience and a long-term perspective, which is hard to ask for when so many immediate and urgent needs are before us. So why does it matter? Professor Stiglitz highlighted that, and COVID has really shown for us in a really stark way why we need multilateral institutions. We're in the interdependent, interconnected world. Global threats require a global response. And as Prime Minister Trudeau and a number of others have said, no one of us is safe until all of us are safe. The effective multilateral institutions have global reach, coordinate actions, support national and regional responses, and they help address and fill any gaps that appear as you move through the crisis. And they actually benefit all people. And this crisis has underscored the value of multilateralism and the importance of countries working together on vaccines, on assisting the vulnerable, and on trade facilitation and minimizing choke points on critical goods and services, just to mention a few. So obviously, multilateral systems need to be seen as relevant to today's challenges. They need to be seen as responding effectively to the current crisis and all that it has exposed, to the secondary and tertiary effects of the crisis, and to the coming recession and liquidity crisis. Failure to do so could undermine global confidence in them as solution providers. So this too will depend on the many elements which are really hard to predict at this time. So many organizations and multilateral systems will come through the crisis stronger, while others will require strengthening or reform. So it's important to underscore that multilateral organizations are as strong and effective or as weak as we, members, let them be. And Canada really does take its responsibilities as a member seriously. To this end, our Prime Minister and many of our ministers have been working actively through forums like the G7, the G20, the UN, the World Bank and IMF, WTO and OECD, and the Alliance for Multilateralism to drive actions on the COVID response. And public servants work closely with organizations and in the various multilateral fora on a daily basis to help ensure that Canadian values are reflected and Canadian dollars are well spent. To maintain the best of a rules-based order and to build back better, multilateralism and its institutions will be key, as will making them more efficient, fair, and more inclusive. In a recent keynote address to the C.D. Howe Institute's virtual roundtable on June 18th, Canada's Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs spoke about the need to be strategic in creating nimble alliances, new partners, and support to the most vital institutions, the need for greater diversity of trusted partners, old and new, and even more work through issue-based coalitions, and that here reinforcing effective international institutions and being responsive to shifting dynamics will be key. And here I would add also that we need to continue to be very innovative. So I'll stop there and send it back to you, Senator Boone.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Leslie. Thank you for those comments, and I think that's a very good segue, in fact, to our next speaker, who knows the international system intimately, because he has been in the United Nations for many years with different experiences all over the world, and this is something that I think Fabrizio Hochschild-Drummond can offer to us. He is Undersecretary. He works closely with the Secretary General. For those of you who have not read Secretary General Guterres' speech or seen it on Nelson Mandela, it is a brilliant speech. I highly commend it. Of course, Fabrizio is in charge of reflecting on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and of course, with that, it also suggests where it might be going. So, Fabrizio, you have the screen. After that, we will go and have a question session amongst the panelists. Fabrizio.
Thank you very much, Senator Boone, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here. I'd like to start by echoing and then elaborating some of the points that have already been made. As Professor Stiglitz explained in much more articulate language than I ever could, the trust deficit in international institutions was there before COVID. And as both he and Ambassador Norton said, the pandemic and its effects have exacerbated that lack of trust. I think one also has to acknowledge that the loss of trust isn't only centered on international institutions. I think, especially in the Western world, many have pointed out recent decades have seen a much broader loss of trust in traditional institutions. And I'd also like to go and spend a few brief minutes on the causes behind that. I think one can, no doubt oversimplifying a highly complex and fluid matter, identify three causes. The first and the most often cited is exactly what Professor Stiglitz explained, a sense of the excesses of globalization and a disappointment economic outcome of globalization. I think that went hand in hand also with a sense of globalization leading to people feeling alienated in their own places. A prominent sociologist who teaches in California, Ali Russell, documented this phenomena in the US in a book with the title Strangers in Their Own Land. And I think that sense of globalization, not only leading to many for lack of the promised economic progress, but moreover, somehow alienating people from their roots, led to this what some see as a counter trend of a greater attachment to the controllable, to the local, and the rise of nativism. I think a second factor, which of course is linked, is a sense that there's a great growth of uncertainty, the world somewhere is again at a pivot point, and our 20th century institutions are ill adapted to 21st century challenges such as climate change, the disruptive effect of new technologies, demographic upheaval, and the fallout from globalization. And those fears and that sense of discontent, unites left and right, only they come to different conclusions with regard to what the adequate answer is. But in essence, in many cases, they're born of very similar fears and very similar hopes. And the third factor is the perception that international institutions don't deliver on their promises. They're long on rhetoric and short on results. And as Ambassador Norton said, perhaps the most painful, but also the most visible indicator of that is the failure of the security, the repeated failures of the Security Council, but in particular, the failure of the Security Council 9 years on, hundreds of thousands of dead later, millions of uprooted later, to be able to agree on how to bring about peace and put an end to the conflict in Syria. And I've spoken in pre-COVID dates to students all over the world. And when one raises the word about the UN, from Japan to Kazakhstan to southern Chile, inevitably the failure of the Security Council to agree on Syria is one of the first criticisms mentioned. But it's also about climate change and the sense that there were important agreements in Paris in 2016, and 4 years on in Madrid, progress was far, far short of the commitments made. Now, of course, the ability of the UN to deliver depends on many factors, but one critical one, and this was stressed by Professor Stiglitz, is the degree of convergence of views among its member states, and in particular of the superpowers. And the lack of global coherence and unity in COVID that was also made very clear by previous speakers has much less to do with a lack of expertise in the UN, although when it comes to this disease, there's certainly a lack of expertise, but it has much more to do with the lack of willingness to coordinate public health approaches across borders because of very divergent national and private sector interests along the lines that Professor Stiglitz very candidly presented. So there's no doubt that global distrust has been strengthened between the major powers by COVID. And what I would argue, and I say this on the basis of anecdotal evidence from talking to ambassadors here, there's also an inclination among many, and this may be controversial, among many of our traditional friends, in light of the superpower standoff, to submit to a certain multilateralism fatigue. Things that just seem to be too difficult in the current environment, and it's much easier to reach agreements with like-minded states, with fragmented alliances, and not to bother too much about the universal, because in the current fractured superpower rivalry-dominated atmosphere, it's just too hard. So I think that the superpower rivalry, in the negative impact of it, is compounded by a broader but much less advertised fatigue among our traditional friends. And I think it's also a little bit against that backdrop that Ambassador Norton, in a recent interview, said, can the UN prevail under these circumstances? And today, in a very good article in Pass Blue, a Brazilian civil society activist and academic, Giovanna Quelle, said, and I quote, and do UN diplomats concentrate too narrowly on intrigue and power plays in New York and fail to see the bigger picture of real world effects? So I put those questions out there. But I think, it's too easy as a UN civil servant to blame our failures on lack of unity among member states or superpower rivalry. I think we need to have a hard look at ourselves and be honest about our own internal shortcomings. And I think that begins by listening, especially to the critical voices and especially to the growing proportion of global population that is young and often disenchanted, by linking up, as Professor Schmidtke said at the outset, with that discontent and the hopes and fears that underlie that popular discontent. I think we need to go back to we, the peoples. I mean, the divisions were always with us. I would argue that the divisions in the 50s between the superpowers, ideologically and philosophically, were at least as great, if not greater, than they are today. The difference was, next to those divisions, there was a common sense, a common lot of fear and hope that we need to build on. And I think we need to go back to that common set of fears and hopes. And that's exactly what we've been trying to do through marking the 75th anniversary and trying to get a global listening exercise going, especially involving youth in all countries, and especially involving those whom we don't speak adequately to, around three questions. What would you like the world to look like 25 years from now? What are the biggest threats to the realization of that vision? And how do you see the UN being rejuvenated to better address the gap? And it's very surprising, amidst all the divisions that we hear so much about that have been dwelt upon, just how common some of the results are. And now we've heard from close to 500,000 people in 193 countries, just how unified their fears and hopes are. And it's probably there that we need to reconnect. So I think, as the Secretary General said in the Mandela lecture, which Senator Boehm, you referred to just now, the Secretary General said in that Mandela lecture just last week, COVID-19 is like an X-ray revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies we have built. It has equally laid bare the fragility of our multilateral system that pre-COVID was already under serious strain. But the key question now is, will we have the same foresight, the same commitment as those who came before us and lived through the much more devastating crisis of the Second World War, to use the crisis to come out wiser and better and with more commitment to future generations? Or will we really be characterized, like Professor Stiglitz described some of the actors active now, as the generation of greed and the generation of what's possible for me now, and rather than concerning the broader interests of future generations, what sentiments will prevail? And I think there it is critical, and that's exactly what we're trying to do, to reach out and reconnect with those universal aspirations and universal fears, which our early results from our exercise show are there and ever stronger. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for those insightful comments. I would encourage the other panelists to turn on their videos and also unmute themselves, because I think we're going to have a little bit of a discussion now. I've been following the Q's and A's that have been coming in as well. I, of course, have many questions and fewer answers, actually. But I wanted to encapsulate a few. So Fabrizio, in your remarks, you talked about fatigue in multilateralism. This is something I detected earlier in my previous international development career. There's also donor fatigue. And it's increasingly difficult for governments to respond to, Leslie, as you said, the greatest appeal in the history of the UN that Mark Lowcock has just launched, to come up and put dollars forward when in fact governments have taken fiscal measures and monetary measures to deal with the impact, the economic impact of the pandemic. So this is a bit of a problem, and there's also the fatigue associated with UN reform, because so much of that has been focused, at least in the public mind, on the Security Council, and the very good work that the specialized agencies are doing all over the world seems to get short shrift. So my question that I would ask, in fact, all of you, how do you overcome the multilateral fatigue and this related problem that Joe Stiglitz mentioned in his remarks, that we are trying to get convergence, but in terms of values and approaches, we are diverging. Yet we do have to work together. So let me go to Professor Stiglitz first.
So one aspect of this is in the economics. I've been actually heartened by a bill that was just introduced into the Senate 2 days ago to have a $2 trillion issuance of special drawing rights. Those are like money that's printed by the IMF and goes can be reallocated to address the problems of the emerging markets in developing countries. And as I say, the fact that it has such strong support in the Senate was really heartening to me. It's also, of course, disappointing that one of the senators raised opposition to it, and so it's not clear whether it will go through. But the fact that there was such strong support for it really says maybe there's a recognition that we're all in this boat together, and that, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, there won't be a strong recovery, economic recovery or a health recovery in any country unless it's global in nature. So the nature of the global pandemic, I think, has reinforced the belief that we're all in this boat together and we have to work together. So I guess the final point I guess I make is that among the progressive community in the United States, internationalism is still very strong. So it is part of the counter trend to the protectionist trend. And as we see that protectionist trend not working, maybe they'll be fatigued with the fatigue and realize that we have to go in a different direction.
Great. Thank you. Leslie, did you have a comment?
I did actually. I was actually thinking about that the pandemic actually has strengthened multilateralism I just was thinking of the many different coordination groups that have been set up. I can give you two examples. For instance, Minister Champagne had established a ministerial coordination group on COVID-19. They had 9 meetings, since March. It was initially looking at travel restrictions, but then turned to trade and emergency measures and a range of other things. And also our Minister of International Development also was at the forefront of international efforts, and with the UK counterpart set up a development ministers contact group. GC health ministers have met so many times since January. There's been no fewer than 18 G7 meetings and no fewer than 12 G20 leader level and ministerial meetings since March. So while on one hand, I think there is fatigue, I think on the other hand, that the pandemic has really strengthened global coordination and perhaps given a shot in the arm, at this fatigue piece. Maybe it's been a little bit of an adrenaline shot in the arm for multilateralism.
Okay,
Over.
Fabrizio, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yes, please. I think the fatigue that I referred to refers to the difficulty diplomats have, which have been exacerbated now by the conditions of COVID. I mean, diplomacy is a contact sport. It doesn't work well through Zoom. What many diplomats feel in light of superpower rivalry that is coloring and infecting everything, at least here in New York. Geneva might be a little bit better off in that respect. But I don't think it's a broadly held sentiment. I think to the extent it's promoted as a broadly held sentiment, I think that's a bit of a myth. In pre-COVID days, a prominent German foundation in Germany did a survey with the title Gemeinsam allein. Should we go it alone or together? And the responses were very interesting. 70% said they had no idea what multilateralism meant. So that word itself is rather abstract and academic, and we keep hearing that here in the Americas as well. But 95%, and this is a country where at that time 15 to 20% of the population were voting consistently for extreme right-wing parties. 95% in a representative scientific survey said they wanted to see their government engage in more international cooperation. So I think this dichotomy that either you're a nationalist, a patriot, or you're a globalist or an internationalist is a forced dichotomy, at least for young people. And that's coming out very strongly from the work we're doing. I think especially people below a certain age group, but not exclusively, recognize that whether we like it or not, an ever more interdependent, interconnected world, you inevitably, if you want to be a true patriot, a true nationalist, you also have to care about what happens elsewhere, because it does come back to bear on you. And I think people have realized multilateralism is not an ideology. It's not something abstract and intellectual. To the degree it works, it saves lives, and to the degree it doesn't work, lives are lost. And I think COVID has been a tragically painful illustrator of that. And we have this irony, which we see very strongly. When we embarked on this global listening tour, people said, but with COVID, people have other concerns. How can you be asking questions about their future? They're just worried for their lives. On the contrary, when COVID hit, our responses shot up because at this forced moment of reflection, the isolationism, the border closures have ironically made people think more globally, more about what worries elsewhere, more focused on the news of what's happening in other countries. So I think, that talking about reconnecting with popular sentiment, youth sentiment, popular disillusion, I think there's a massive demand out there for more and better, not more of the same, more and better international cooperation, that far from the fatigue. But I do think the fact that many leaders haven't necessarily adjusted to that is yet another sign of the broader disconnect often between the leadership and sentiment on the street.
Well, thank you. I listened carefully to what Leslie said about the various meetings that have taken place, and I'm picking up on some of the questions that have come to us. I know the G20 leaders met and immediately decided to inject $5 trillion of liquidity into the system. G7, others have been meeting. But on the question of vaccine and working together on a COVID-19 vaccine, this has been something of a failure, and certainly the editor of The Lancet has recently come out and said that. Now, how can countries, governments, and indeed international organizations stimulate an approach that would be good for the global commons in terms of having a vaccine that would be accessible to all in a fair way, that would be in keeping with the spirit. No one talks about the SDGs anymore in the 2030 agenda. This is going to be something that's going to be even more difficult to achieve than it initially was when everyone agreed on it. So is there a way, is there a magic formula, or is this going to become a newer version of beggar my neighbor and become infect my neighbor, and who cares? Any thoughts?
Well, let me begin by saying, I mentioned very briefly in my remarks the efforts that were going on in the World Health Organization, the initiative of Costa Rica to make sure that all the intellectual property, all the knowledge was available to everybody, and that there would be some prioritization of if there's a scarcity of the vaccine, that who gets it first, make sure that the healthcare workers who protect others are first in line. So among large parts of the world, there is a sense of community and a prioritization. And my concern, on the other hand, some of the drug companies and some of the countries are taking the view, we'll do everything we can to make sure we're first in line. Our lives are more important than others, and we'll use our money to make sure that our lives are protected before others. Obviously, those are two very contrasting views of the world. The interesting thing, or at least one aspect of that, is that in the intellectual property framework that's embedded in WTO and other agreements is the idea of compulsory licenses. That in fact, this is one of those instances where compulsory licenses will be widely used if necessary. And so the attempt to hoard the knowledge, if you want to think of it, to make profits, is unlikely to be very successful. So in a way, I'm more optimistic because we have a safeguard provision in the compulsory license provisions that will prevent the excesses that might otherwise have occurred.
That's a very interesting comment. Does anyone else want to comment on this?
Peter, if I may,
Yeah.
I had spoken about the global collaboration called the ACT Accelerator. So WHO has been working on developing an allocation framework in the context of the ACT Accelerator with multiple stakeholders, such as Gavi, CEPI, Unitaid, Wellcome Trust, and FIND. And that this is to help ensure fair allocation of the COVID-19 diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. And currently WHO member states are working to help shape this framework. Now, within the vaccines pillar of the ACT Accelerator, it's all very technical. Gavi and CEPI have created what they're calling a global access facility, or COVAX facility for short. That's the acronym. And it's a global pooled procurement mechanism for COVID-19 vaccines. And it's really, the purpose is designed to foster equitable access for participating countries and help end essentially the acute phase of the pandemic. So this is something that was announced in June, and it really is being called, it's being called vaccine multilateralism. And so there are, Professor Stiglitz had mentioned the Costa Rican initiative. There are a number of initiatives underway within the ecosystem right now, and a lot of dynamism, and I would say that a lot of rejuvenated energy trying to work just on this issue.
Can I add one more thing?
Of course.
This kind of sharing has been part of our framework. There's a sharing every year in developing the new flu vaccine. As you know, influenza changes all the time, and there's part of multilateralism has been a open process in which all the information about the evolution of the flu every year is shared, and on the basis of that, every year a new flu vaccine is developed. So we actually have you might call it a multilateral, global, open framework for sharing knowledge that I hope will be, the kind of thing that we'll be developing as we respond to COVID-19.
So, Joe, you don't think that knowledge could be weaponized the way that trade measures have been recently? Not naming any countries specifically.
It could be, obviously, some countries, but I think I am very hopeful that the new administration that hopefully will be elected in November will rejoin multilateralism. A key plank of it is global cooperation, that we can do more together, that it would be better for the American people as well as for everybody else in the world if we cooperate as Leslie was saying, you know, in developing the vaccines and determining access for everybody. You know, the virus doesn't recognize boundaries, and so we have to make sure it isn't spreading around the world. So I think that's a framework, and it's a framework that we have to use for every one of the global issues: climate change, international security, and aid.
Absolutely. Thank you. Fabrizio, did you want to comment on the global common good in that particular context?
I think, I mean, the Secretary General has been very outspoken with the support of many member states, including Canada, and has co-hosted with WHO very early on the push for a common fund for a universally accessible vaccine. So the UN's position there is, I think, unequivocal. You know, there's much speculation around what multilateralism will look like in the post-COVID world. And, you know, the worst case scenario is that we will fall into an era of greater isolationism and more fragmentation, rival blocks, fluid blocks of like-minded alliances, but very little focus on the universal. That's the worst case. The best case is the sort of reset, what WEF likes to call the global reset, what others, the Secretary General talks about reimagine multilateralism, but so a sort of massively reinvigorated, renewed multilateralism. But there's a third way, which I find quite interesting, that a number of columnists and academics have written about, where they talk about moderate multilateralism. Multilateralism that, for example, in the economic sphere, will be scaled back, not least because, as Professor Stiglitz said, many are asking, well, why did we lose our manufacturing capacities onshore? And this dependency on the globalization of our supply chains is very dangerous. So a scaling back in some areas of multilateral approaches, but a scaling up in areas where the global common good is absolutely indisputable. I mean, I'm not an economist, but you know, perhaps the ability, you know, to ship fizzy mineral water around the world is not essential to our well-being. Perhaps, you know, we should be able to get local mineral water in every restaurant rather than always being dependent on the strange market dynamics that sometimes make something taken from very far away cheaper. But two areas where the global common good is indisputable is the climate change. No country, however powerful, however big, however rich, no bloc, power bloc, however powerful, however big or rich, is gonna be able to solve that alone. And the other is global health. I would add to that the disruptive effect of new technologies, but that maybe some would dispute, and we also seem to be firmly on the wrong track when it comes to governance of new technologies, global governance. But so I think there is an argument out there that may become stronger and stronger post-COVID of a new form of multilateralism that is more focused and more focused on essential, indisputable elements of the common, the global public common goods, and that is climate change and health at the very least.
Yeah, can I just second that and add the list that will be a little longer? I mean, obviously, the oceans that we share, water that is may become increasingly scarce. But I think the point is, the key word is focus on the things that we have to solve together, and then recognize that there are going to be other areas where we'll go our own way, where our actions don't necessarily affect those of others. We want them to behave in other ways. We will try to persuade them to behave in other ways. But in the end, we have to recognize that different people may decide to live differently, as long as it's not imposing large costs on others.
There was a question also from a former colleague of mine regarding digitalization and whether we can use digitalization and disruptive technologies in a positive way to overcome the differences that exist. Indeed, we're providing a demonstration of this right now, because we didn't have a carbon footprint in terms of getting together like this, which is a good thing. And that's changing the way we work, as Leslie mentioned at the very beginning. But with digitalization and with using social media in particular, it gets a bit self-defeating in terms of getting the message out and the responses that come back, because not everything can be boiled down into just a number of characters on Twitter. So I'm wondering if there's a way to harness these technologies, particularly as Fabrizio mentioned, youth and the future. The youth of today do not know what happened at San Francisco 75 years ago. They did not see that tremendous leadership that was put forward by several countries, notably the United States of America, in terms of establishing the UN, establishing the Bretton Woods institutions to try to avoid a situation where there would be a global conflagration of one kind or another. So are we using, our governments and are the international organizations using the digitalization to greater effect, and could more be done?
Well, can I express three, you might say, naysayer perspectives on this worry I have about digitalization. It obviously has this enormous opportunity for us to get together without a carbon footprint. But the first is that it has also been the basis of an enormous amount of misinformation. And the title of this session was Trust and Multilateralism. And one of the things is that misinformation has undermined trust in many of our institutions. A very large fraction of Americans say they don't want to get a vaccine if it's available because they don't trust what the vaccine is. So I worry a lot about our difficulties of taming social media and what it will be doing to undermining democratic processes. The second is digitalization has enabled the tech giants to avoid taxes. And the basis of collective action, which we've all recognized is so important, collective action at the national level and the global level, is resources. And if the major source of new profits are able to avoid their share of taxation and exhibit little social responsibility, that's a problem. And the third goes back to the issue of values that I referred to in my introductory remarks. I worry about the surveillance economy, the surveillance society. And, part of our deep seated values are about democracy and human rights. And we are seeing in some parts of the world the use of surveillance technologies that may represent the worst abuse of those basic freedoms.
Thank you. Fabrizio.
Thank you. No, I would share what Professor Stiglitz said. I think the digital technology has been massively enabling, but has also brought to light many, many difficulties. I mean, this pandemic and the confinement it has required has been very difficult. But let's face it, without digital technologies, it would have been impossible. I mean, the fact that we can have this meeting, the fact that most of us can continue working, the fact that we can keep our kids or grandkids or the next generation educated, the fact that we can keep socially see doctors online is all thanks to digital. The fact that scientists can cooperate across time zones and share information in real time is thanks to digital. The fact that the rights of freedom of movement can be maintained for so many people in countries like South Korea is thanks to some form of surveillance that allows shutdowns to be very targeted. So it's brought huge benefits, but it's also highlighted tremendous problems. One is that those benefits only affect half the world. And when it comes to women, it's not even half of all women. So our ability to cope with this pandemic, of those of us connected, means that those who are left behind, also economically left behind, are left even further behind. So pre-existing inequalities will be exacerbated within and between countries. Secondly, the insecurity has risen. I mean, the ITU estimates that there was between a 50 and a 70% increase in internet use. Almost every internet provider you speak to will speak about somewhere between a 200 and a 500% increase in attacks. And some of those attacks have been on health facilities and on the WHO, I mean, the increase. So there's been a much greater increase in security incidents than there has been an overall increase in access to the internet. And then, yes, the internet has allowed a massive spread of public health information in real time, but it's also allowed for the spread of huge disinformation. But I think in that sense, it's also started a very healthy debate among tech providers that was unthinkable just 2 years ago, where finally some of the big tech providers are saying, yes, we also have to have some responsibility for the content that is transmitted on our platforms. And we can't just wash our hands and say we can't be treated like other media. And however many people scream fire in the cinema without there being a fire, if it happens online, it doesn't count as endangering the public. So I think in that sense, but I think the bottom line is it's here to stay. We're not going back to pre-COVID days and analog days. The world has become more digital, whether we like it or not. So the real challenge now is how do we get together, as the world did. The very first GA resolution of the UN is on how to steer the peaceful use of nuclear technologies. So how do we do the same now in the digital age? It won't, obviously will have to be done differently, much faster, much more nimbly, much more decentralized. But how do we as a global community come together better to steer this for good, to contain the harms? And I think that's the real challenge now, because we're not going back digitally. It's too late for that. So the demand now is steerage. And we seem to be fragmenting into little digital domains and power blocks, which I don't think is healthy, which I think undermines one of the principal virtues of the digital, is that it does collapse spaces, but the logic of making it a divisive force seems to be at the moment stronger than the unifying aim. But that's why I think the Secretary General also just launched a roadmap on digital cooperation, which precisely is to try and help us overcome those divides and focus at the very least on things that should not be so controversial, like making the internet safe for children, like overcoming the digital divide, like ensuring that there's digital inclusion. And I think that has to be one of the global priorities emerging from COVID.
Well, thank you very much. There are many questions that we could still be asking and concerns. One of my concerns is that as countries that have graduated from least developed status are in fact taking their own fiscal measures, they're coming into a situation where they're going to need ODA once again. So that means that the DAC at the OECD and indeed the UN system is going to have to look at this more carefully. On health, it's obvious. On education, children all over the world are losing, in some cases, a year, maybe more. In developing countries, education is critical. Related to that as well is gender, and I think that is something that governments are really going to have to look at, because women are going to feel the brunt of this. It's happening already. We're seeing it in developed countries like my own, but we're seeing it in other places as well. So these are all concerns, and there is also a mental health concern as this continues as well. What is the impact on traditional thinking, on the nuclear family, on the extended family, on those who are infected, who are dying, and they can't even be buried, or you can't even say farewell to them. So there's so much going on. So one of the things that we thought we would do in this webinar is also come up with some prescriptive potential solutions to all of these great problems. The panelists have provided a number of them in their remarks, but now I'm going to give each panelist 2 minutes to conclude and to perhaps consolidate their thinking. And I will start with Professor Stiglitz. Joe?
Oh, well,
sorry to put you on the spot.
You have put me on the spot, but let me begin by some of the, you might say, short-run measures within existing institutions, and then obviously broadening out from that. As I mentioned, right now and as you mentioned, there is a real fiscal problem facing developing countries and emerging markets. There's going to be their debt crisis, and there are things that individual countries can do. A few individual countries. There are things that the IMF and the UN system, the World Bank, the regional banks can do. So I mentioned the debt problem. It is really important that, the fact that while the rest of the world was stopped, interest kept, the financial system kept charging interest and charging interest on interest is an asymmetry that has enormous consequences. The laws governing debt, the debt contracts, are mostly London and New York State. And this is an instance where the legal frameworks have called force majeure, necessity, say that that they have to be invoked and the governments need to be outspoken, and the UN can take a role in saying this is a situation where these debts have to be restructured. It's not just a question of standstills that have been called for by the G20. The problem is the ability of these countries ever to fulfill these contracts. So it's a debt restructuring. The second point is the framework, the multilateral framework created has a provision for the issuance of SDR, which is like global money going.
Yep.
We already created a tool that we should be using, and we should be using massively. So these are simple programmatic things that can make a very big difference in the midst of this pandemic. There is a call for what is called the reallocation of the SDRs, that countries like Canada, United States, European countries that don't need the SDRs can reallocate them to the countries, the emerging markets, essentially no cost to their citizens, but enormous benefit to the developing countries and emerging markets, a way that we can provide assistance to those who really need it.
Okay.
And so that's another tool that individual countries can do. Now, as I think all of us have said very forcefully, we have become aware of the need for multilateralism. The pandemic, climate change, and I like the way that it was put before. We are going to have to restructure multilateralism, I think, to focus on the things that are at the core of the global commons, so the global common good. And that should be where our efforts should be working going forward.
Thank you very much. I will go to Fabrizio next, and then to Leslie to provide the Canadian perspective at the end. Fabrizio.
Thank you. No, the UN came into being in a meeting room in Washington in January 1942, where the President Roosevelt hosted a meeting with Churchill and the leaders of Russia and China. So in essence, the UN was born based on universal fears and aspirations, but by four men coming together in a room. I think today things have changed radically. I don't think it's a gathering of a limited number of men in a room that will lead to the rebirth we need of multilateralism. The Secretary General said in January of this year, before COVID, that if multilateralism is to survive, it has to become much more inclusive. And I think we have to be much better connected, as Professor Schmidtke said at the outset, with popular discontent and voices anywhere. And because that drives change. I mean, not only is it necessary, but it's what drives change. Think of Black Lives Matter here, think of the Me Too movement, think of Fridays for the Future. So I think we need to include youth much better. I think we need to include, have much more diverse voices. And I think the road is set. There was, I mean, on the plus side, I've probably been, ironically, the more negative, although I'm the most UN person, but on the plus side that I think Ambassador Norton has been so good about reminding us, I would add the draft that has been put together by diplomats in New York for the UN 75 declaration, which sets out the future challenges for the UN and is not a list of 50 things. It's a list of 7 major challenges ahead of the UN, external challenges, and then about another 5 internal ones. And one of them talks about being much more inclusive. So I think there is the basis there. There's a follow-up mechanism foreseen. The Secretary General is going to be invited to make very broad-reaching recommendations on what a reimagined multilateralism could look like. And he's already taking a very different methodology. He's not, as we would have done in the past, just seeking heads of state to come together and form a panel. He's reaching out to civil society organizations, think tanks across the world to get their ideas. So I think that's what's fundamental.
Thank you very much. So to wrap up the concluding round, Ambassador Norton. Leslie.
Thank you. So I'll start off by saying it's really important to stay optimistic. I don't think pessimism and cynicism are really helping anyone right now. And I think we really need to work with what we've got, but we have to make it more effective, more efficient. We need to reinforce it, reform it, and make it actually, as Fabrizio said, to actually mirror the current day population. It's interesting because multilateralism is underway every day on so many levels, and we don't have our eyes on all of that. But I had mentioned in my talking points the need to create these nimble alliances, new partners, and continue to reinforce and provide support to the vital institutions that are addressing the challenges of today that we're facing, and for what folks had called also for the global common good. And I would also add the SDGs to the list that was also put there. it's never been more clear than now the need for not only more diverse partners, but more diversity and more inclusion. And I think we're going to see a lot of issue-based coalitions continue to flourish. Now, I just want to conclude with a really personal reflection, if I may, from sitting on the front lines of the multilateral global health response to COVID-19 here in Geneva, the capital of global health, and the HQ of the World Health Organization. So for the vast majority of countries, rather than eroding trust in multilateral institutions, COVID has in fact underscored the critical importance. And as we've said, viruses know no borders and individual countries. And it really is my hope, again, back to that optimism thing, that it serves as a catalyst for a deeper commitment to multilateralism and global solidarity. So it's not just about doing good or helping the poorest and the most vulnerable, but I think it's also ensuring that those key values that are important to Canada and Canadians and to liberal democracies, that these values and interests are also advanced. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's a very positive note to end on. And before passing it over to Professor Ghittoni, I just wanted to say, for me, it's been an honor to moderate this great discussion. I'd encourage everyone to get your thoughts out on social media. No doubt there will be many responses. So thank you again to the Victoria Forum, and thank you to the three distinguished panelists that we had. Professor Ghittoni, over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this outstanding webinar. So I should confess that this is maybe an amazing gift I received for my birthday. So this is an amazing panel discussion, very challenging to think about the future and the common future. So merci pour modérateur, sénateur Bohms, Professor Stiglitz, Ambassador Norton, and Monsieur Fabrizio, as he wants us to call him, so Mr. Horshid Druman. So I would like to thank also the champions. So this webinar was facilitated and organized by Dean Sol Klein and Sébastien Beaulieu. I'm sorry that Sébastien did not attend this one, and he's in his way right now to Senegal. So we wish him safe travels. Also, thanks to our partners for this webinar. So Center for Global Studies and the Canadian International Council. The upcoming webinar, which is in 2 weeks from now, and I hope you will join us for this very interesting and timely conversation around evidence-based decision-making and the trust in science. And Christy and Tad put together this panel, and they will be talking about the evidence-based decision-making, especially in response to the COVID-19. Also, we have a lineup of webinars until November. So the one that is after that, so on August 20th, we will be talking about the Great Reset with participation from the IMF, the World Bank, and other interesting financial institutions. So Basma and Amadou, they are championing that particular webinar. On September 3rd, we'll be going back to the multilateralism, but more from a globalization perspective. And we will be talking especially the impact in trust in globalization. And is it the end of globalization, or is it a new type of globalization? And again, Sol and Reem, they are working on this webinar. Please also save the date for November. November, we will try to get together for about a think tank style forum in order to be able to draft a number of recommendations and solutions for moving forward. And we focus on the 3 divides. So the social divide, the environmental divide, and the economic divide. So we hope that our panelists and the attendees will join us for those days. And as I said, it is a more participatory, inclusive type of work. It's not really just speaking, but it is drafting solutions. These webinars and the Victoria Forum, the virtual Victoria Forum in this November and the Victoria Forum in 2021 are all jointly organized by the University of Victoria and the Senate. And we thank TELUS and Vancity for their generous support and involvement and engagement in this. And I think some of the conversation we heard today about the role of digital companies and the finance. So these two companies, they both represent those two sectors. So the digital economy and the finance. Last call for action. So please take a few moments to fill the survey. So it is UN 75 online, and this is part of the UN 75 celebrations. Thank you very much, and get engaged, be safe, and thanks to the frontline workers.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes today's Victoria Forum webinar. Thank you to all our panelists and attendees for joining the conversation. Have a lovely day.